that's as loud as it goes.
Yeah, let me try.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We're about to start our second class on the general topic of Judaism and racism. If you remember from last week, we spent most of the time talking about reparations. And what was so interesting is that we actually found texts in the Torah and in Chazal and the rabbinic literature that basically directly spoke to the issue of reparations. It's called mitzvahs ha'anaka, the mitzvah of when your slave is set free to make sure that the slave has the wherewithal, the means to, in a dignified and respectful way, to start his or her life over again and to actually succeed and to prosper. This actually was reflected in 1863 and 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation. The original idea was that every single former slave would be given 40 acres and a mule. The idea being that they would actually be able to then have their own property, have their own form of sustenance, and to be able to go on. And obviously it's a counterfactual, but it's a really interesting question to imagine. This didn't happen because the next president after Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, came along and rescinded that order, and the slaves never got it. And I've heard many people who are actually opposed to reparations, but they actually say one of the greatest tragedies of American history is that the slaves did not receive reparations initially. The only objection that a lot of people have today is, how could reparations be given right now to the descendants of slaves? And furthermore, who is paying? The American people at large. Many people in America right now, they weren't even here during the slavery. We didn't even benefit. And obviously the arguments go back and forth. And we're not going to rehash all the arguments, but I do want to just say that one point that in thinking about the class from last week that I really was thinking a lot about is the basic idea. Like, if you agree that there is a concept called ha'anaka, that when a slave goes free, we have an obligation to make sure that that slave is taken care of. And that did not happen with the overwhelming majority of slaves. What would be the legal or ethical mechanism to say that that obligation no longer exists? I mean, I understand the practical argument that it would cost us $12 to $15 trillion, and will that work? Is it even feasible? Whatever it is. But just from an ethical perspective, what is the argument to be made? And that I really, have not heard. I mean, you could say it's not going to work, it's not going to help. Some people say it further victimize. Even I've heard from voices within the Black community, people who are opposed to it would say it further victimizes. I hear all the arguments, but from an ethical perspective, that basic question of, the Gemara says, "Lo va'afilu yarshim," that the mitzvah of Hanukkah goes to the former slave and even to the yorshim, even the inheritors, the descendants, if for whatever reason it did not go to the slave. Obviously, there are legal technical questions, but that's something that I feel like we have we have to grapple with, and that's definitely there. Okay, so today's class, we are going to turn to a different topic, which is a little more. I said at the end of last week that we were going to talk about police question. I decided to push that off for a different class. Maybe we'll get to it in a different class. I wanted to talk about a few things before we get to that. And also I want to figure out my own thoughts on the issue. One other thing, I am obviously not an expert on this in any kind of way. I've done a lot of reading, a lot of research in the last few weeks to get ready for the class. Obviously, we all have our own thoughts. But the only thing that I'm going to do, and this is something that I'm going to say over and over again, is I'm going to be able to take some issues that are in the news that we're thinking about, that there are protests about in our country, that are greatly, in a certain way, causing a lot of our great debates in our country right now. And what does Judaism have to say about it? And when I ask the question, what does Judaism have to say about it? I don't mean let's point to a particular pasuk and say, oh, you see that side's right, or you see that side's right, or a passage from the Gemara to say, oh, here's a line from the Shulchan Aruch. We're not going to find that on these issues, but we will find ways to think about it, framing, and I think that itself is an important process. So today's class is on the question of, when we are making policies in our country, should they be what some people call colorblind or race neutral, meaning they should have no consideration at all about the race of individuals. You are treated completely as an individual, as any other American, as any other person would. That's race neutral, colorblind. There are different ways to refer to it. And the other approach is called race conscious, which means that when we make policies, when we try to figure out how to structure our society, we should take race into consideration. We should take historical oppression and historical legacy of oppression and loss of income and different ways that that our country has made it hard historically, which everybody agrees, that's not a disagreement, for people of certain communities, for African Americans, for others. Should we take that into account when we make policies? Those are basically the two questions. And it's a big conceptual question. One of probably the biggest concrete examples is the question of affirmative action. That's obviously a very specific concrete example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a little video that I just found online, because I think it brings up a lot of issues. It's primarily about affirmative action. It's a little bit on the light side. I figure it's past 8 o'clock at night. Maybe we're a little tired, but it's educational. But at the same time, I think it brings a lot of the points. I read a lot of articles about this, and this video, I think, is a little bit easier. So we're going to start with this video. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on one second. And after I share my screen, if someone can give me a thumbs up just to let me know that it's, do you see this video here? Okay, perfect. All right, here we go.
High school, affirmative action.
Sorry about that.
Now, when I was in high school, affirmative action just seemed like some buzzword from back in the day. But when me and my friends actually started applying to college, it was something that came up a lot. Affirmative action is back in the news, and this time, Harvard is getting sued. Now, usually these types of lawsuits make the claim that when race is considered in college admissions, white people are unfairly discriminated against. But this lawsuit is claiming Asian Americans are the ones being hurt by these policies. Plot twist. So while this lawsuit against Harvard has a new angle, it really does boil down to an age-old debate over affirmative action. Should race be a factor in college admissions? Okay, so when it comes to college admissions, affirmative action refers to policies where race and gender are considered in the application process. Now, they're not the only thing that colleges are looking at. They're still looking at your grades, your SAT scores, extracurricular activities, all that good stuff. But they also take into account your race and gender in an effort to help ensure that women and minorities are getting equal access to higher education. The idea was born out of the civil rights movement in the 1960s as a way to help counter the longstanding racist and sexist barriers that kept minorities and women out of elite universities. Barriers like, I don't know, the fact that women couldn't get a degree from Harvard until 1963, or the idea that people of color weren't as smart as white people. The 60s were messed up, man. We needed rules to help. Some see affirmative action as kind of like a counterbalance to legacy admission policies, which is when applicants get preferential treatment if someone in their family attended the school, a perk that tends to benefit wealthy white applicants, since they were the only ones getting into these elite schools in the first place. And to be clear, affirmative action isn't always about race. It's definitely helped a lot of white women, but now that co-ed is kind of the norm, the controversy is almost always over race. And over the years, there's been a stream of lawsuits challenging it, mostly from people who feel they've been unfairly rejected because of race. The most recent being this Harvard case. So let's take a look at both sides of the argument. Those in favor of affirmative action see it as a way to fight long-standing discrimination when it comes to educational opportunities. They think it's necessary in making sure that minorities with good academic standing have access to higher education. And there is some data to support this. 8 states have essentially banned affirmative action practices and instead have what's known as race-blind admission policies. So the New York Times looked at admissions data from public universities in a bunch of those states, and they found that when schools got rid of affirmative action, there was a dip in Black and Latino students, even as their populations grew. But it wasn't true for every university and state. In fact, Florida has actually done a pretty good job of keeping its enrollment of Black and Latino students at pace with the population, despite getting rid of affirmative action. Yep, you heard me right. That was Florida, the same Florida that brings you headlines like these. Affirmative action advocates also point out that a more diverse campus benefits everyone, not just the students it's specifically designed to help. With a diverse student body, all students learn valuable interpersonal skills outside of the classroom, like how to interact and respect people that are different from you, skills that set you up for a successful life in a diverse world. Now, that doesn't mean that being nice to people of color is going to get you a lot of money, but who knows? And then once you get into the real world, there's evidence that diverse teams make better decisions and are actually even more profitable to businesses. So maybe I was wrong. But if you're on the other side of this argument, you don't see affirmative action that way. Many opponents believe that affirmative action policies are themselves discriminatory and can actually create racial tension. They say that qualified candidates end up getting rejected from schools while less qualified minority applicants get accepted for the sake of diversity. They even have a term for this: reverse discrimination. And at elite schools, less qualified could be the difference between perfect SAT scores and getting one question wrong. And this discrimination is kind of what the Harvard lawsuit is all about. The plaintiffs are essentially claiming that Harvard is holding Asian Americans to a higher standard because they don't want too many getting in compared to other groups. And the argument goes, this can hurt race relations. If people are assuming that minority students are only at a school because they got special treatment, then those students might not be seen as equals in the eyes of their professors and their peers, even if they would have gotten in without affirmative action. And that doesn't exactly create an environment of inclusiveness. Some opponents say that instead of being race-based, affirmative action should be class-based. That way, a student of a single white mom from Appalachia or a low-income Asian immigrant family would get a leg up. Then you're not actively hurting poor whites or Asians. And of course, there are other opponents that think even that's too far and just want college admissions to be based on merit, like looking at your test scores and your GPA. There's also the argument that affirmative action isn't even really working. According to another New York Times analysis, admissions of Black and Latino students is still lacking at many top universities. And instead of focusing efforts on affirmative action policies, some opponents think that we should tackle the problems that both low income and students of color face early in the education system. Problems like lack of resources or advanced courses. That way, we set students up for success from the beginning. So the debate over affirmative action has been raging for years, and Americans are pretty split on the issue. It brings up some great questions about what we value as a society and how we ensure equality. Now, I know you all have some opinions about this. So should race be a factor in college admissions? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of college admissions.
Okay, let me get rid of that one. Okay, now. Can you see my next source sheet that I have up here? Okay, excellent. So 1 second. All right, perfect. So obviously that video, maybe it wasn't the most academic. Last time I brought you actual congressional hearings on the two sides. This was a little bit more lighthearted, but I think it really adequately brought out a lot of the issues. Obviously African Americans and women also, and many different categories of people, if you will, have not had the same opportunities. And in order to give a greater sense of equality, on the one hand, it would make sense to have policies that take that into consideration in terms of jobs, in terms of education. On the other hand, right, we certainly have a value of treating each person as an individual. I mean, here, if you look on the source sheet, this is from Wikipedia, but obviously the advocates of the colorblind or the race neutral approach, they often love to quote, Martin Luther King, because that's a good quote if you want to make an argument when it comes to issues around race. And the famous quote from, I believe, the I Have a Dream speech, where Martin Luther King says, "I dream of the day where my children are judged based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin." So that kind of an idea, of course, Martin Luther King said a lot of other things, but if you just take that idea and you take it out of context of the speech, really, it really reflects this idea that every single person should be treated as an individual, not as part of a group. They shouldn't be able to have advances because of the group that they're part of, and they also shouldn't be held back because of the group that they're part of. This is the idea of racial colorblindness. Now, criticism of that, if you just look here in this little paragraph here, where my cursor is, Leslie G. Carr published Colorblind Racism, which reviewed the history of racist ideologies in America. She saw colorblindness as an ideology that undercuts the legal and political foundation of integration and affirmative action. Another book that supports that argument, Stephanie Wildman, writes that many Americans who advocate a merit-based, race-free worldview do not acknowledge the systems of privilege which benefit them. For example, many Americans rely on a social and sometimes even financial inheritance from previous generations. She argues that this inheritance is unlikely to be forthcoming if one's ancestors were slaves and privileges whiteness, maleness, and heterosexuality. So basically, the argument is, it's not fair to have a colorblind policy when there are already so many inequalities built into the system, that maybe you need to have a race conscious policy, one that takes race into consideration in order to even out the playing field. And then maybe in some ideal future, maybe then we can go back to having a race neutral policy or a colorblind policy. I mean, for me, the whole thing is very, very interesting. Just to give a personal comment here, I grew up in a many people know I grew up in a more of a traditional society, in a Haredi community. And when I grew up in 1980s in Cleveland, my friends, I mean, and amongst the people I knew, unfortunately, I'll be honest, there was a lot of racism. And then the interesting thing was that it was the racists who were not advocating a colorblind approach, right? They were saying, no, people of color, African Americans, they had not nice words to say about them. I grew up I'm ashamed to imagine and remember some of the conversations that I even had with some of my friends. That's just the reality of the way it was. They would say, no, there are differences between the races. That's what people actually believed. Now we're past that. And here the irony is that people who are more on the conservative side today are advocating for racial neutral policies, and people who are more on the progressive side are saying, no, race should be an issue. We should take race into consideration when we're making policies. I mean, that's just a little bit of an interesting shift. I think has happened. I know there are people here who know a lot more. I actually see my mother-in-law on the call. This is her area of expertise. She's written books about this and many articles. So I'm sure after the class, I'll get the truth. But I'm just saying, in terms of my own experience of racism, that's kind of interesting to see that, 30 or 40 years ago, people who were, I would say, more on the conservative side back then, and people who were, the racism back then was definitely much more a racism of Blacks are, let's say, inherently inferior. These are very troubling ideas. Nowadays, right, that is like, nobody would, I'm not, of course, there are still people who believe that, and there are still white supremacists, but that's not something that people would advocate. So now people who are accused of not being sensitive enough to racism, it's because they're not acknowledging systemic racism. They're not acknowledging how the structure of the country and the history, and they're not taking that into effect when considering these issues. I think that's a pretty interesting a shift that's actually taken place. But of course, a lot of that's going to speak into all of these issues. So when you think about the question of affirmative action or any policy, that you either want to just have a race blind or a race neutral, colorblind approach versus taking race into consideration, race conscious policy, really at its heart, what it's really saying is, how should we look at the world? How do we do that? Do we look at each person as an individual? We don't care about their race. We don't care about their gender. We don't care where they come from, their ethnic origin. They are going to be judged based on the merits of what they do, right? We're judging people as individuals. That's really what the race blind, the race neutral approach is trying to say. The other approach is saying, no, there's a whole history of why whole groups of people might be at a disadvantage, and you have to actually focus on groups. You actually have to not treat people just as individuals, but part of groups that might have been historically oppressed or discriminated against. And therefore, we have to give whole groups or people, just because they belong to a certain group, a leg up. Now, you heard in last week's class, Coleman Hughes, who is more on the conservative side of this question, as an African American, he strongly objected to that, because he would say, why are you going to do that? I grew up an upper middle class family, wherever he grew up. Go to Harvard. Why am I supposed to get any special treatment because I'm Black? That didn't make any sense to him. So these are the questions. These are the complicated questions. So now I want to start thinking about it from a halachic or Jewish, I'm going to say Jewish legal perspective, but really just a Jewish textual perspective. As we start analyzing Jewish texts, what do you have? By the way, I do have my chat box open. The chat box open. You can feel free to put comments in there. I'll try to address them. Also, if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and you can ask any question. Last time, I think I just spoke basically for 45 minutes. It's sometimes hard on Zoom. So feel free to jump in. But here we go. what is Judaism's approach to this question in general terms? Does Judaism view individuals, view people, and make policies and make halacha and make law just for individuals? We only judge you based on the content of your character, only based on what your accomplishments are, what you're able to do. Is that how Judaism works? Or does Judaism and halacha put people into boxes, into groups, into various groupings, and then based on different groupings that we have, makes different law? So sometimes, yes, the law will not only be based on what you've done, on what you've accomplished, on what you as an individual have done, but as you as part of a group. What do you think? What's Judaism's approach to this question? Anyone want to offer an initial thought on this?
There are clearly different categories of people.
Exactly.
Based on heritage, could be based on action. I'm thinking, there's a million reasons for why somebody can be categorized, and it affects them for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And some of that could be as a result of their parentage, or other things, or their own actions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And some of them are beneficial, and some of them can actually hurt them, can actually impede their progress in the world. So I just made a few categories here. I mean, and all of these things would be completely unacceptable in modern Western law and American law. Jew versus non-Jew, that's a very, very basic category, right? We have halachic differences between Jews and non-Jews. And we don't judge people. We don't say, oh, Mr. Non-Jew comes along. In fact, we had a passage in the Daf Yomi, was it today or yesterday? I think it was today, actually, this morning, where an Aramean, someone who was not Jewish, wanted to participate in the Paschal sacrifice, in the Korban Pesach. And the Jewish people did everything they could to make sure that he did not participate in the Korban Pesach. You cannot participate. What do you mean? The person loved God, the person maybe loved the holiday of Passover, but they were not from the group of people, the direct descendants of slaves, right? So therefore, that Aramean was not entitled to participate in the Korban Pesach. That's a race-conscious policy. More than that, that's a race-based policy, all right? We have within Judaism, Kohen, Levi, and Yisrael. Who can do the service of the temple? Only Kohanim. Who can do the singing? Only them. Let's say you go to college and you study music and you want to be a Levite in the temple to play all the beautiful music, and you're fully qualified. We want to know what family you're from. And let's say there is a Levite who is less qualified. One of the arguments against affirmative action is that, people who are less qualified end up getting certain spots. Well, if you're a Levite, but you're less musically talented than the non-Levite who wants to play the music in the temple, what will happen? You as a Levite will win out. That's just how it works. We have within the tribe of Kohanim, let's say a Kohen marries a woman who's forbidden to him. Let's say a Kohen would marry a woman who's divorced. The child would be a halal. So all of his cousins who are Kohanim, they come to the temple during their time to do service, and they're allowed to do service. This Kohen, who's now the son of a Kohen who has married a woman who he's forbidden to marry, he learns all the laws, is totally qualified, is better than everybody else, and doesn't get in, right? Judaism is full of these things. Mamzer, right? If you're the child of a let's say a woman who was married, who has an affair with another man, and there's a child, that person can't marry in. There are all these laws about marriage. In America, all of these things would be unconstitutional. They would all be illegal. These would all be violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? They would be all illegal in America. You could not have any of these things. I'm not advocating these things. I'm just saying the idea, when we start thinking about these things from a Jewish perspective, the idea of saying that Judaism, it would be hard to make the argument that Judaism follows this Western idea, this modern Western, which I actually very much identify with. That it doesn't matter where you come from, right? You should be able to do anything that you're qualified and capable of doing. That's not necessarily something that's so accepted in Judaism, right? Or in any traditional society for that matter. All right. So what else do we have? Now we also have some categories where the groups, these are actually, some of these that I've mentioned are categories that make it harder for you to be able to do something. Like for instance, if you're a halal, right? You're one of those Kohanes, you're a Kohen whose father decided to get married to a woman who he wasn't allowed to marry, then you can't do the service no matter how qualified and no matter what the content of your character is. We're going to judge you by the fact who your father was and what your father did. That's just how it is. But then there are other categories where we go out of our way to help and support you because you're a member of a certain group of people. What are those examples? We have in the Torah many, many times concepts of ger, yatom, ve'almana. The Torah goes out of its way to tell us that we have to take special attention and we have to make sure to care for a ger. What's a ger? Two interpretations. Either a ger means someone who is what's called the ger tzedek, meaning they converted to Judaism. But a ger could also just mean a foreigner, someone who comes from a different country. They're a foreigner. Now they're living in the land of Israel. There are special laws, special treatment of how we have to treat anyone who's from that category. And we'll see some of the laws. It doesn't matter if that person has prospered, if they're wealthy. There's an assumption that if you're from that group of people, it's highly likely that you are going to need help. And there are certain halachot and laws of how we have to help them out. Even if, like Coleman Hughes, you happen to have grown up an upper middle class person. But if you're in the category of people called gerim, you're going to get some affirmative action. That's the reality. Yatom va'almana, widow and orphan. What about that? So you say, well, that's not really a category. You're an individual. We're judging you based on your personal circumstance because you happen to be a widow, you happen to be an orphan, right? And you could make that argument, but we're going to see very, very interesting texts that say that if you're part of the category of widows, you are going to have certain benefits, even if you happen to be wealthy, meaning maybe we assume that most widows, especially in the ancient world, didn't have means of support. But actually, we're going to find out that the halacha is actually doing, in a certain sense, affirmative action for an almana. Now, again, whenever I say it, I'm not saying, therefore, let's take from these ideas and say, boom, America should have this or shouldn't have it. We can't prove it that way. We're just trying to think through these issues. Of course, we have categories of slave, of people who are free, men and women, right? In America, you would never say all the laws that we have in Orthodox Judaism about men and women. So if you're part of the category of men, right? Halacha has affirmative action for men. Halacha has reverse discrimination. Halacha discriminates in favor of men, right? If you have a man and a woman who are trying to both become, the rabbi of a synagogue, other than a few synagogues, I see Rabbi Cooper's on Rabbi Cooper had to compete for his job as a rabbi here against women applicants. But most Orthodox synagogues, if you are applying for a job, if there is a woman who wants to apply for the job of rabbi, including Beth Shalom, I'm assuming for senior rabbi, that would be the case. Even if she is much more qualified than any of the men who are applying, she will not be able to apply. She will not get the job. I mean, we do this all the time in traditional societies. There are many other examples. I don't have to get through all of them. So clearly the notion that when we start looking at Jewish texts, that we only view people as individuals and what is their merit is not true, because it's not true in terms of issues of gender. It's not true in terms of issue of Jew and non-Jew. It's not true in terms of issue of Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. We are very much about putting people into different groups and different categories and making different laws based on that. That's what we do all the time. I'm not saying that America should adopt these things, right? I think that's one of the beautiful things about American Western democracy, that even if you're part of a traditional society, that doesn't matter. But when it comes to American law, in fact, I was talking to a rabbi who was way more to the right, and he was telling me how opposed he was to the idea of women's spiritual leadership in Orthodoxy. But he told me, he happens to be a rabbi who happens to also have a job in government, and he told me that when it comes to the secular realm, he believes very strongly in women's advancement, and he has mentored many women, and he thinks and he believes that women should have the equal opportunities. So I'm not saying that we should necessarily take the whole system of Judaism and apply it to American secular law, but I'm saying the idea that to say as Jews that the notion that we should look at categories of people is just simply wrong. Well, we could say that, but then we'd have a very hard time with basically all of halacha and the entire halachic system, which essentially does that all the time. Okay, but let's ask the question, just to get it off the table. I just have a little quote here. Do we do that? Is Judaism race conscious in terms of race? So this is just a quote from Rabbi Bleich. He has a very interesting article which might come up in other classes. It's called Black Jews, a Halachic Perspective, where he goes through halachic questions about the Ethiopian Jews and different Jews throughout history who are Black and what's their halachic status. But he says, this is very interesting line, I just saw it and I said, I got to quote it here. Judaism is colorblind. Skin pigmentation is unknown as a halachic concept. The problem of determining the status of the various communities of Black Jews is totally unrelated to color. The sole issue is that of Jewish identity. The question of recognition of Black Jews as members of the Jewish community must be seen within the context. As such, it is simply one instance of the much broader question of who is a Jew. In other words, in theory, I'm not saying that there is no racism in the Orthodox community. Unfortunately, I've experienced my share of it, of hearing it and hearing racist things. I'm not saying there isn't, but in theory, right, there should be no questions of racism within the Jewish community. In other words, even though we have categories of Jews and non-Jews, but if you have someone who is halachically Jewish, let's say, for instance, you have someone who is a Black Jew, let's say they converted to Judaism, let's say they came from a Christian family, but they convert to Judaism, or let's say they are a Black Jew, let's say someone who is an Ethiopian Jew, then if they are halachically Jewish, there is absolutely no question that person should be able to 100% be able to marry all Jews, and they are treated 100% as Jewish. There's no distinction made. In that sense, Judaism is colorblind. And see, here's the thing. In this context, what Rabbi Bleich was saying, and I think he wrote this probably 15, 20 years ago, that's a very important statement. And we want to hear that. We definitely want to hear that. And that's why I think it's kind of challenging for us. It's challenging for me. I'll just put myself out there because I come from a place where not everybody would have accepted this. Where I grew up, most parents would not have been okay with most white parents that I knew, and every parent that I knew was white, would not have been, I'll be honest, they would not have been okay with their child marrying a Black Jew, even if that person had converted 100% with the strictest rabbi, and according to all positions were fully Jewish. They wouldn't have said that. They actually were not colorblind, right? And it's so interesting because now, that's when I was a kid. Now, 30 years later, those same people, right, are probably advocating the colorblind approach, right? And it's the progressives who are saying, no, we need to take race race needs to be a very, very important category. That if you're colorblind, you're really perpetuating racism because there's so much systemic racism. So even if you are colorblind yourself, you're not addressing the systemic issues and you're allowing racism or racial inequality to continue. It's just very, very interesting. This is like a personal issue that I have in terms of my own thinking around the issue. Anyway, so the Rabbi Bleich's statement is very important, but that's only talking about the issue of race. When you talk about the general question of does Judaism or does halacha look at the individual? Do we judge you based on the content of your character, based on your merits, or based on the group that you're from? Judaism obviously does have a system of really looking at what group you're from. Sometimes that can hold you back, and sometimes there's affirmative action towards you that can actually help you out. So let's actually dive into this whole issue of the ger, the yatom, and the almanah, which is the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan. There are some pretty amazing psukim here. So we start with Shemot, Exodus chapter 22. The verse says as follows: "V'ger lo toneh v'lo tilchatzenu." You shall not oppress or wrong a stranger. Stranger really means a foreigner, I would really translate it as. Ki gerim hayisam b'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The Torah basically says 36 times don't hurt the ger, don't hurt the person who is a foreigner, because you were a foreigner, you know what it was like to be in the land of Egypt. Now you could say, yeah, but look what they did to us. Now it's our turn, right? No, that's not what the Torah wants us to say. This is the whole purpose of the Pesach Seder. We remember what it felt like. And now that when we have power, we can't turn around and do the same thing. In fact, we have to help out those who are vulnerable. Now it says, Kol amalna v'yatom lo ta'anun. This is verse 21. You shall not ill treat, that's how it's translated, or oppress any widow or any orphan. Im ane ta'ane oto, if you do mistreat him, any of these categories of people, ki im tza'ok yitzak elai, if that person cries out to me, says God, shamoa eshma tzakaso, I'm going to listen to his cry. V'chora api is very harsh language. I will get very angry, says God. V'haragti eschem b'charav, I'm going to kill you by the sword. You are oppressing widows and orphans. If you do that, what will happen? And they cry out, says God, I'm going to kill you. And then your wives and children will be widows and orphans. Very, very harsh response and punishment for that. But, the question that's right away that's asked is, again, going back to this question, almana v'yatom, the widow and the orphan. Are we here making categories? Are we making the category of the ger, of the foreigner? What if there's a foreigner who has resources? What if there is a widow who's very wealthy? So I'm going to skip down just a few texts. I'll come back to this in a second. If you look here at Rashi on that verse, Rashi says, Kol amanav yatom lo tanun. I'm sorry, it's not translated, that any widow and any orphan you should not mistreat. So Rashi says, what is there? Is it only forbidden to mistreat, to abuse the widow and the orphan? Are you allowed to abuse regular people? So let's say you have in your business, right? Let's say you're a business owner and you have employees, and there's a widow who's working for you. And there's just a person who's a regular person who's not a widow. Is there only a prohibition to oppress, to harass, to abuse the widow? No, it should apply to anyone. In fact, there are other verses that say you cannot oppress anybody. Why does the Torah have to specifically go out of its way to tell us not to oppress the widow and the orphan? So Rashi says, Hu adin l'chol adam, you know what? This halacha really applies to all people. And the prohibition equally applies to people who are widows and people who are not widows. The pasuk oftentimes speaks about the more common situation. We have to be aware of what's the more common situation. They are weak in a certain way. They're vulnerable. They don't have the same support network. And so there's a disparity, right, in terms of their ill treatment. When you look at the whole category of people who are ill-treated, there's a higher percentage of widows and orphans, especially in the ancient world, who would have been ill-treated versus regular people. So therefore, it's not that the Torah is telling you that there's no prohibition to treat poorly and to harass and to abuse people who are not widows and orphans. Of course, you can't do that to anybody. However, the Torah is just making us aware that this is a problem, right? I mean, similarly, this has oftentimes become a question. Why are we going to have a policy, it even came up in the video, that's going to help out a poor person of color from the inner city? Why do we not have another policy that helps out white people from Appalachia, right? This is like a critique that you'll have. So Rashi might say, look, we're just pointing out it's worthwhile to have this because there's going to be more often than not, there'll be a higher percentage of people who are from vulnerable groups that are going to be in that situation. So now the race neutral approach would say, no, let's not look at that. We don't want to look at that. All we want to know is we want to look at all of the individual American citizens. And maybe if we want to have some sort of welfare system or whatever it is, system to help out people who are impoverished, let's look at class, let's look at income levels, and anybody, regardless of their race, regardless of their category, who is under a certain level, we should give this help. And anyone who is above that level, we shouldn't. We should not have any regard to it. But that's just not the way that the Torah, of course, does it, right? Now you say, well, that's an ancient society. We can't bring a proof. I agree with you. Nothing here is a proof. This is really just trying to think it through. But actually, Ramban, Nachmanides, takes a little further. And he says, Vitam kol almana afilu ashira ba'alas nechasim. The reason that the verse says kol almana, which means any widow, you can't mistreat, it means even if she is wealthy. Some of the other commentators say, even if she is the wife of the king, so the king of Israel dies, his wife is a widow, she has tons of resources, she has herself servants and slaves. There's a special prohibition. In addition to the regular prohibition of not mistreating anybody, there's a special prohibition of mistreating the widow, even if she is wealthy and of tremendous means and not vulnerable at all. Why? Because her tears are right there. She's a widow. And her soul is, low down, meaning she's had a hard time. And so this is really very much looking at categories of people, even though you might say, yeah, this person, Coleman Hughes, is upper middle class, living and is in Harvard, and he's got all the advantages. Yes, but maybe, I'm not saying that it would apply automatically, but just like when we have this category of widows, and we're saying, even if you have widows who happen to be not they're part of the category of people, but they happen to be advantaged, it doesn't matter. All of the special rules would actually apply to them. It's interesting, just as an aside, when I was in yeshiva, when I was in high school, I went to the Talmudical Yeshiva of Philadelphia. And because whenever I think about the concept almana, a widow, I always think about the cook, the chef for our yeshiva, for our high school, for the high school and the Beit Midrash, for the entire school. What happened was, the food was really, really bad. It was pretty terrible in the yeshiva. Like literally, we would go to yeshiva. Here we are, growing boys, and we basically had almost nothing. The food was really bad. What was the story? 20 years before that, her husband, who was a real chef, was the chef in the yeshiva, and he was apparently very good, and he passed away. And his wife was an almana. And so the rabbis of the yeshiva, they couldn't bear not having her have a job. So what do? They just made her the chef. She wasn't good. She wasn't qualified. She wasn't, but they just did it because she's an almana. There's such a sensitivity to people who are almana. And because of that, for 20 years in the yeshiva, people came and the food was not really what it should have been, but that's just, and we always knew that. That's what we knew as students in the yeshiva. It doesn't matter if the food's good or not, because we called her the Rebbitzin. That's what we called her. The Rebbitzin is an almana, and therefore she has this job basically for life. That's exactly what happened in the yeshiva. So we have categories of people. I thought this next source, let's go back to, I want to go back to some of the psukim, and then the verses in the Torah, and then we'll go back and we'll look at some of the other ideas. This is a really astounding text here. Shemot, this is from Exodus chapter 23. It's just a little further from the verse from the source that I quoted before. The ger lo tilchatz, you should not oppress a stranger, again, a foreigner. The atem yidatem es nefesh hager. You know the feelings of the stranger. You know what it's like to be a stranger. Why? Ki gerim hayisem be'eretz Mitzrayim, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. There are lots of curious things about this verse. First of all, who's the you? The you in the Torah is not just talking about that generation, the first generation to go into the land of Israel. First of all, even that first generation that went into the land of Israel, they were not actually foreigners. They were not foreigners in the land of Egypt, because that whole generation died out. It was the next generation. But this verse is talking about future generations. And it's saying that you know what it's like. So this goes back to one of the points that I brought up last time, which is in Judaism, we're very, very good at imagining ourselves being in a different time. So we imagine what it was like to be slaves in Egypt. We know what it's like. So we therefore have to know the nefesh hager. Again, what does this mean? You have to know the nefesh hager. Could you imagine in a contemporary setting saying this? Having a law that says the law should favor a certain group of people that previously have not had chances or opportunities, because you should know what it feels like to be that person, to be in that group. This is not an individual. It's not saying you know what it's like to be John, who was who went through this. It's you know what it's like. We as Jews should always know what it's like to be that category, to be part of that category. It's a very, very powerful thing. And again, once again, it is very much, in my opinion, affirming this idea that when we view society, we do view it as, there are groups, there are ethnic groups, there are groups of people who have experienced certain things. And by being a member of that group, sometimes that can impede you, sometimes that gives you certain responsibilities, and sometimes it gives you certain advantages. Max, are you raising your hand? Did you want to say something? You have to unmute yourself, though. Can you unmute yourself? No, we can't hear you.
How about now?
Perfect.
I just wanted to bring up that we were slaves in Egypt something like 4,000 years ago. And am I correct in saying we were there 400 years?
Yes, there are certain debates about the exact numbers, but
So we were strangers for 400 years. They didn't know, the Egyptians didn't know anything about us. We were still strangers for 4 centuries. I don't agree with that.
yeah, that's why I also agree with you. I don't like the translation stranger. A ger normally means like a foreigner, someone who is not from that place. Now you'll say, how can you not be from that place for 400 years? But if you are slaves, the descendants of slaves, whose ancestors were slaves, you were never really in that place. You never had a holding. They never owned any land there. I mean, actually, certain Jews did have land, the tribe of Levi, perhaps, but it was very, very complicated. But I agree with you. I wouldn't translate it as stranger. I would probably translate it as a foreigner. Okay. Yes. David.
Non-native.
Non-native. That's also another way to say it. David.
As I look at these sources, could the argument be made that these sources are saying not to do something bad, but it doesn't, I haven't seen any of these sources say to do something in particular that would be good. In other words, you're not supposed to ill-treat the widow and orphan, but it doesn't say to specially treat the widow and orphan. And in fact, I'm trying to remember where in the Torah it is, but in talking about judgments, I think it's in Mishpatim, it says that the judges are not supposed to favor the widow and orphan in a judgment.
Correct. Yes.
So are there sources that instead of just saying, don't do anything wrong, give a helping hand?
Right. Yeah, there are. In fact, I think the next source sort of says this, but there are also some rabbinic sources that say that. For instance, one of the rabbinic interpretations, halachic, that the rabbis always want to give halachic concrete examples. So when it says any widow or orphan, you should not mistreat, that's a very general statement. So one of the interpretations is, I mean, it might sound very, very detailed and concrete and, very specific, but one example is if, let's say there's a queue, you know about this, David, from your legal professional life. Let's say there are a bunch of people who are waiting for a court date. The rule is that if one of them is an orphan, you have to let the orphan go first. They jump in front of the queue. I don't know. That's a very particular example. You'll say, well, what's the big deal about that? But people want to have a speedy trial, right? They want to, especially if they have a case. Let's say the orphan was taking someone to court, to suing someone, or let's say the orphan was claiming that someone owed them $10,000 and there was a long line at the court and they might not be able to retrieve their money for 2 weeks. We let them go first in line. So there are concrete examples. Furthermore, in the next source, I think it does say this a little more explicitly, or let's skip one source. Let's go to source number 8. But by the way, what I'm going to do is, hold on one second. I'm going to share the source sheet copy link just so you guys can have it if you want to. I'm going to put it in the chat box. So if you guys want to copy it up and save it for yourself, you can have it there. I see as I'm looking at the chat box, Danny asked, wasn't Sipporah Moshe's wife a Cushite? There's a lot of question about what does that mean? Was Moshe married to a woman who was black? It's definitely the simple interpretation of the text. Absolutely. Okay. Anyways, let's look at this source from Devarim, from Deuteronomy. Hashem, your God, is the supreme God. Hakel, Hagadol, Hagibor, V'Hanora, the great, the mighty, the awesome God. Asher lo yisa panim v'lo yikach shochat. God shows no favor, takes no bribe. Osa mishpat yatom v'almanah. Maybe this is what you were referring to, David. Upholds the cause of the widow, of the orphan and the widow. It's interesting, it switches them around. The Ohev Ger, and Hashem, God loves the foreigner, Laseislo lechem v'simla, to provide him with food and clothing. So you must also do this, meaning there's an idea that God takes care of all of these people. Therefore, we also have to take care of all these people. So here, this is obviously active. Now, you might say, well, this is really just telling you that you should do chesed. You should be kind to certain groups of people. This is not about, this is not about law. This is not saying they should be able to get into college at a higher rate or whatever it is, like affirmative action type things. But it definitely is a more positive kind of approach. And many, I actually have to look it up. What concrete laws are derived from some of these verses? And that's one approach. So this is definitely the approach, and it's in the sources, in my opinion, pretty clear, where we do actually view people as members of groups. Sometimes that actually can hold them back in certain ways. If they're not a Kohen, you can't do the service in the temple. If you're not a Levi, you can't do it. On the other hand, of course, that favors Kohanim and Levim. That's just the way it is. Other times, it actually is a certain sense of affirmative action, let's say with the Yatom, the Almanah, the Ger. It doesn't matter. When we talk about this category of Ger, we don't say if this person is upper middle class or whatever it is, or even very wealthy, or if they're the widow of the king and they have everything that they want, everything they need, there still are particular responsibilities that we would have because they're part of that category. That's just the way it works. But now, if you look in this other pasuk, I think it goes in a slightly different way. This pasuk in Vayikra says, Mishpat echad yeh lachem, kager ke'ezrach yeh. You shall have one law, one standard for the stranger and the citizen alike, meaning the stranger and the person who is born a Jew. Everyone is treated the same. Ki ani Hashem Elokechem, I'm Hashem your God, right? Now, you could say this means don't discriminate against people like that. They all have to be treated equally, but being treated equally means being treated equally on both ways. I mean, you can agree with it or disagree with it. And obviously, this is more of a conservative position. But if you look back to this little thing, this quote from Chief Justice John Roberts, it's an interesting quote. The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discrimination on the basis of race, basically saying that we can't really fight discrimination when we have all of these laws on the books that are essentially discriminating. Now, they're discriminating in order to do affirmative action. But basically, we had all of these sources. I think that both of the ideas are actually in the sources. We have ideas about helping out different categories, the Ger, the Yatom, V'Amanah. And then at a certain level, we also talk about there being there shouldn't be preferential treatment. Everybody has to be treated alike. So I want to look at a few more sources here. I think this was a great source from the Hamik Dover. The Hamik Dover is the Nitziv from Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. He was the head of the Volozhin or Yeshiva. He lived in the 1800s. Very, very important rabbinic thinker in Russia, and he was actually one of the strong proponents of the whole yeshiva system, where people would go away to yeshiva. He was oftentimes like one of the first big fundraisers to support his yeshiva. He was a very, very important figure in, I think, 19th century Russia. And he says as follows, and I'm sorry I haven't translated. Kol almana v'yatom. This is going back to the verse that says that every widow and every orphan, we have to make sure not to mistreat. He says, Lashon kol, when it says the word kol, Ba'lelamed, it comes to teach you, afilu hani ditzrichim musar v'hadracha, v'rashayim bekach. Let's say there are individuals who actually need musar. They need guidance. They need discipline, right? Let's say you're a teacher. And this is actually a very interesting question that I was reading about, which is like disciplinary actions. One of the pieces of data that's used to support the idea that there's racial disparities, let's say in the education system, is if you look even in lower school and middle school, there are tremendous racial disparities in terms of discipline, in terms of suspensions from school, in terms of detentions, in terms of every single measure of disciplinary action, there are tremendous racial disparities, right? So if you follow, here's the question, right? If you follow the halacha that says the ger, the yatom, the almanah, all these categories of people, we can't, mistreat. So and even if you do want to apply it and you want to accept an idea that maybe this would apply also to racial groups, if you want to accept that, would you therefore say that discipline can't be taken, right? Now, obviously, when this is being used, it's not saying that they shouldn't be disciplined, saying that that's a proof that there must be systemic inequalities which are leading to the disciplinary to the behavior which is leading to the disciplinary action. But the point is, should you then punish, if you will, a yatom v'almanah? Let's say you're in a situation where you have to punish them. So he says, of course you can still do it. Mikol makom chova lizar behem shlo ya'anun yoter min ha'hechrech habaror. There's a special obligation when it comes to the widow or the orphan. Let's say you're a teacher in school, and one of the children in your classroom, forget about all these race questions. Let's say you're a teacher in a yeshiva, right? And one of the kids in the classroom is an orphan, right? So what do? Do we say everybody's judged based on the content of their character? This kid did something wrong. Just like I punished the other kid, I'm going to punish this kid the same exact way. No. When it comes to the orphan, you still have to discipline because we want to make sure that they improve their behavior, but it shouldn't be more min ha'hechrech habaror. That's absolutely necessary. Shouldn't be an iota more than it's absolutely necessary. And that's a special law when it comes to an orphan. We have special rules. Notice there's special rules for different people, even within this very specific context. And he says, when it says in the verse, uksiv lo ta'anun, I thought this was so interesting. It says, don't oppress them, the widow and the orphan, bilashon rabim. That's an acronym that stands for lashon rabim, meaning do not, you, plural, should not be oppressing a widow and an orphan. Kasav Harava, the Ibn Ezra explains, Mishum dekol haroe adam. What's the plural? The question is, if one person is mistreating the widow and the orphan, what's the plural? You shouldn't be oppressing plural, multiple people. And he says, because anyone who sees adam shu ma'ana yatov amon, if you see somebody else oppressing the widow and the orphan, or I'm going to extend this to any group of people that for whatever reason might feel particular harm in these situations, v'lo ya'azrein, you don't step up for them, you don't help out, gamhu yichashev ma'aneh, you're also included, you're also culpable. That's why it's plural. Don't oppress plural because you're part of it. And he quotes a verse from Isaiah, which says, and here's the verse from Isaiah, I just quoted it right here, very interesting, where Isaiah is saying, look, our holy temple, our pride, where our fathers praised you, Hashem, has been consumed by fire. All that was dear to us is ruined. At such things will you restrain yourself, Lord? Meaning, Hashem, how can you let this happen? How can you let the temple be destroyed? Will you stand idly by, ute'anenu ad ma'od, and let us suffer, let us be oppressed? It's the same word, enoi, affliction. It's the same word, but it's ute'anenu. Will you do that to us? The implication here is, it's almost the chutzpah, that if God allows other people to hurt the Jewish people, then God is oppressing the Jewish people. God is implicated in it. And it's the same thing here, says the Netziv, that when it comes to the prohibition against ill treatment of a widow or an orphan or a convert or a foreigner, or any of these categories of people, if you're part of it, if you're quiet, not only if you do it, but if then you idly stand by, then you're considered an oppressor yourself, right? So sometimes we have questions say, no, this isn't my battle. I'm not racist. I'm fine. I don't have people say I don't have a racist bone in my body, right? This is not my battle. This is not my fight. But if we're standing by and these things are happening, then we are considered to be oppressors ourselves. That's a very, very important idea in Judaism, obviously, and it's right there in that text. Okay, we're running out of time. You can look at some of these sources on your own. I'll just point out that when it comes to Lashon Hara, in source number 14, that's from the Chafetz Chaim, who was the person who really came up with many, many of the laws and the explanations of the rules of Lashon Hara, again, says the same thing. There's a special commandment, a unique commandment when it comes to Lashon Hara, not to speak Lashon Hara about categories of people that have been previously oppressed, the widow, the orphan, etc. There's a lot of sources here we're not going to have a chance to go through, but I do want to just end with one idea. And this is actually from my teacher, Rabbi Linzer. So I quoted the verse that said, Mishpat echad yalachem. We had all these verses that seem to say that there are categories of people and we have to view them and we have to take mind of where they came from. And this could sometimes actually make challenges, meaning things that you're not allowed to do, and responsibilities, and also affirmative actions or types of things that we have to do. But the verse also said that there should be one law for the foreigner and the citizen alike, meaning everyone's treated exactly the same. And Rav Sadia Gaon just has 3 words on this, and he says, you know what, we see from here that the ger tzedek shall be just like the citizen, meaning they are actually exactly the same. We don't treat them differently. I mean, it's very unclear. I looked in some of the commentaries on Rav Sadia Gaon. It's very unclear exactly what he's saying. But this was my teacher, Rabbi Linzer. he had this take on it. He says as follows: Sadia's Gaon's bracketing of the proactive mitzvot to love and not oppress the ger, and his underscoring of the mitzvah to treat the ger as equal, raises the long-standing debate problem of affirmative action. As long as affirmative action measures are in place, a certain population is being singled out as different and not really treated as equals. On the other hand, as long as there are systemic injustices in society, we need affirmative action to serve as a corrective. We cannot make equality exist just by acting as if it already exists. There is no getting out of this tension, the need for proactive mitzvot and the demand of fully equal treatment. Meaning, on the one hand, of course we want to treat everyone equal. We want racial equality. Racial equality basically means that everybody is treated exactly the same. You're treated based on the content of your character, what you've accomplished, what you've done, not based on your skin color or where you come from. That's of course the ideal. I think that that's of course the ideal. But the problem is, if right now we don't have that equality, there's no way to get there without first taking these measures. That's the argument, right? Now, the problem is that if we do that, think about the ger and the yatom v'almanah. What might that widow who has a means to support herself say? Stop treating me like a widow. I'm okay. Don't make me into a victim, right? Or what might the orphan say? Stop it already, right? Or the ger, he's like, I'm okay. I've been here for 50 years, you know? I know my way around. Don't treat me like that. Stop making, or let's say when you're dealing with disabilities, this is always a very, very complicated question with disabilities, right? So with disabilities inclusion, stop treating me like someone who can't do it. I am able to do it. Maybe I need a certain accommodation. But see, the problem is, one of the challenges is that when you talk about the ger, the yatom, the almanah, all these categories, and especially if you start thinking about affirmative action in light of that, then it really does get to a place where it very quickly could turn into victimization. And that's obviously something that we have to stay away from, but there obviously has to be a balance. And I think that that's coming out in the sources. So I'm just going to end with one source, because a lot of times people are like, what's the answer? And especially this is something that I have a very, very hard time right now listening to some of the debates around Black Lives Matter, around all lives matter. You hear all these things going back and forth. It feels like everything is so black and white, and there isn't any nuance, and there isn't any sense of like, there could be different approaches, and maybe sometimes one approach works, sometimes another approach works. No one approach is always wrong. No one approach is always right. And there could be different approaches and different answers. And in different situations, maybe we'll need a different approach. Maybe in certain situations, for certain time, we will need an affirmative action type approach just to even the playing field. But maybe at other times, if we keep it in place too much, we risk victimizing the very people we're trying to help. And maybe it's not fair. Maybe it shouldn't be like that. But I think that we need that. And I, obviously, since a lot of us are thinking about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who just passed away, this quote I think was very good. I don't know if I think Rabbi Linzer quoted it, or someone else, another lecture that I was reading about this topic quoted it. And he says as follows: diversity is a sign of strength, not weakness. As Yechiel Michal Epstein notably said in the introduction to the Aruch HaShulchan, in the very last of the 613 mitzvos, the mitzvah is to write a Torah. Moshe uses not the word Torah, but Shira. When we refer to the Torah, it's Shira, which is a song. Because in this respect, Torah is like music, that its greatest beauty lies in complex harmonies. You have different tones, different sounds, and you're bringing them all together. Whereas the Netziv, that's the same person who we just read before, writes in his commentary on the Tower of Babel, uniformity of thought is not a sign of freedom, but it's opposite. Our goal here is not to have uniformity of thought. Of course, we have to have policy at the end of the day, but we want to have different opinions. We want to have different ideas. Maybe one solution will work at one time and another time. Almost everything I read in Torah, Tanakh, and Torah Shebaal Peh seems to say likewise. Judaism is the only religion I know, all of whose canonical texts are anthologies of arguments. People say the Talmud is a book of Jewish law. No, it's not. Have you ever opened up a legal code and it says this is one opinion, but one rabbi, when they were coming up with this law, actually had a different opinion? You don't do that. You only say the actual law. Judaism puts both arguments together. Arguments between God and humans, humans and God, humans and one another. The Mishnah preserves the arguments of the sages even when it knows that the law is like one and not the other. The greatest work ever undertaken to eliminate argument from its pages was the Mishnah Torah, and it gave rise to more arguments than any other. Meaning the Rambam, what he tried to do was, he tried to just tell you what the law is. And what happens? On every page of the Rambam, in the commentaries, they argue with him 100 different ways on every single question. That's what Judaism is all about. So I actually think that it's healthy to have debate and different opinions. And yes, we'll figure it out. And these, the policies will, we'll work out it. And it's good to have different strong opinions on the policies. But I don't know, I just don't like the idea of rejecting out of hand any side, either side of both of these questions. I'm gonna just stop my share. I'm gonna look at some of the comments that came at the end, which I didn't have time to address. David says, if you are not part of the solution, you are part of the problem. Absolutely, that's what that text definitely meant. Susan is my mother-in-law. Widows and so it's right no matter what, but let me just see what it says now. Widows and orphans are easy categories to differentiate, but categories like qualified and less qualified are categories with much ambiguity and are linked to systemic views of one group's ideas and what those categories mean. Do you mind sharing a little bit about what that means, Susan? I'm trying to understand what you're saying, what it means. I understand what widows and orphans are easy categories, but if you're willing to share and explain a little bit, we would love to hear.
Okay. Well, there's an assumption that, for example, with college admission, that qualified means the highest grades, the highest scores on an SAT or ACT. That's one assumption of qualified. And that's something that white privileged kids from higher incomes tend to do really well at. But there's so much more in terms of intelligence, qualifications, leadership, character that make for a really heterogeneous learning environment where people can learn from one another. So what does qualified mean? It's one group's, one category's views that tends to privilege one group or another. Therefore, you get the assumption that people who aren't in that group are less qualified.
Absolutely. I think that's very, very important. And certainly, of course, plays into both education and also in terms of work environments too, because having the diversity in the work environments, that would certainly be another argument. And I haven't really seen, oh yeah, there's one source that I did see that actually spoke to that question, that very question. And it was a source about hiring tax collectors, which doesn't sound like the most glamorous job, but the source actually said that you should hire the tax collectors based on the different like clans and tribal groups, so that all of the employees who are doing this together, they have the diversity of the different groups amongst them, so that consequently they'll be able to do a better job as a group, which would not be accomplished if you only look for the highest qualified, in some other metric, So the idea of, I did see that quoted in one article that I read about affirmative action from a Jewish perspective, bringing in that idea. Absolutely. Dan, we'll just get to the last comment here. Is Ger Tzedek different from a Stam Ger? Yes. Typically, the way it's understood is Ger Tzedek refers to a convert. And when they use just the word ger, or a ger toshav, sometimes that's referring to what we would call like a foreigner, someone who is an immigrant or a foreigner, someone who's coming from a different country. But anyway, so we'll stop over here. We got one a few minutes over actually. So we talked about reparations last week. This week we talked about affirmative action, but also issues of whether we should have a race neutral society or a race conscious society, and try to look at it through the prism of halachic sources. And I think these are all really interesting questions. We certainly can see the value in really just judging person by who you are. But halacha clearly does not do that. That doesn't mean that we don't want to advocate in a Western society, in a secular Western society, to judge people by as individuals. But we do see from halacha the idea of privileging in a certain way your group, and maybe if your group has been disadvantaged, to maybe try to give it a leg up, to try to help it out. That's definitely in the halachic and Jewish sources. No question that idea is there. Again, when and how to apply it, I think Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is very helpful for that. One housekeeping note, I did originally say that we would meet next week. I cannot meet next week. I have a different engagement that I have to be part of next Tuesday night, but we will continue the following Tuesday night. I don't have the date with me right now, but next Tuesday night, we're not going to meet, but we will pick up the following Tuesday night. And I'm not yet sure what topic we're going to talk about. But anyways, I want to wish everyone a great night. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a lot of fun to learn with you. These are very, very complicated, complex topics, but I think it's really wonderful and healthy that we're trying to learn them through the prism of our own sources not necessarily come to definite conclusions, but really struggle with them and think about them through our Jewish texts. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Rabbi. That was great. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.